Welcome to the show. This is Brandon Wen, and you're listening to the Understanding Consumer Neuroscience podcast brought to you by the folks at Cloud Army. In this episode, Richard talks to Callum Gould, head of insights for Saddington Baynes. Callum talks about measuring emotional responses to creative works using neuroscience, and how at each step of the way in creating advertisements, neuroscience can help tune the creative process.
Hi, this is Richard Campbell. Welcome to Understanding Consumer Neuroscience. Welcome back. Today, my guest is Callum Gould, who is with Saddington Baynes, which is an award-winning production studio collaborating creatively with the world's best agencies and brands to bring big ideas to life. And his role is as the head of insights. Welcome to the show, Callum. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Richard.
Head of insights.
Yeah, so it's one of those things where insights doesn't really have much of a direct sort of correlation. It could be a whole bunch of different things.
Mm-hmm.
But in this particular circumstance, I guess what it is, it's about understanding the data that we can gather around creativity. Because as a production studio, Saddington Baynes, we kind of create adverts for a whole variety of different companies, and we want to understand how we can kind of create the most effective emotional sort of story around that. So my role as head of insights is to take that data and translate it for creatives, really, and say, this is why you should be making the decisions you're making. This is what will make your content more effective. And yeah, there's a number of ways which you go about collecting that data, but I guess the head of insights part of it is making that storytelling that they do so well visually. I make it with sort of more numbers focused.
Which is interesting because when we talk about creative, it's often we get into this sort of immeasurable part that you'd let the creatives do their thing, and we kind of only apply the numbers kind of later in the game. A lot of the conversations we've had on the show so far is like, well, we have these 6 ads. They've cost a certain amount to produce, but we're about to spend much more in the actual campaign. What is the most effective one? You've seen that strategy, I presume.
Yeah, it's something we see a lot, and I guess it's something which we're looking to kind of challenge in a way. And we sit in a perfect position because we do the whole suite of things. So we do everything from sort of content creation. So when a brand comes to us and saying we're looking to launch a new product in the market, and we've got a vague idea of what we're looking to do on a creative standpoint, and we take that all the way up to when they've actually shot the advert and kind of done the post-production element. So this kind of Photoshop retouching, and that's kind of across that whole suite where we can touch upon and make those changes. And the way we do that is we effectively run research projects which look at understanding the emotional effectiveness. So we match up against various attributes, and they can be something really specific to your brand. So say if your brand really cares about seeing as luxurious, or I don't know, has a strong connection to heritage, we can test specifically against how your visual and your creative content is coming across in that way. Or we can do it much more generally, so looking at it from things like intent to purchase and kind of emotional pull of overall of a piece of content. So what we can achieve there really allows us to optimize the creativity in a certain way. Like you said, people tend to steer away from numbers and creative together, but we sort of talk of it as marrying art with science. So we're not here to take away the creativity at the concept stage. We're not going to be narrowing down and saying we only want you to talk about this specific thing. Like, there is no direct prescriptive way of creativity, and we're aware of that. All we can do is understand what the emotional impact of each different piece of content is, and then take that and optimize functionally throughout that. So there will always be key things we can learn, like specific colors have specific outcomes, or specific backgrounds have specific outcomes.
And I got to think that's very cultural as well, that you've got to...
Yeah, exactly. It can, that on that one, it can come from a whole different bunch of things. So even looking at kind of North America versus Europe, there's going to be certain cultural inferences which are going to be very different. But one of the big things we found, for example, is in automotive work. So when we look at how a car comes across, whether it's from left to right versus right to left, we know that when you see a car, most people generally infer some sort of movement.
Right.
9 times out of 10, when you're talking about a car, it's moving around somewhere. So obviously between the Western and Eastern world, there's different ways of how we read content normally when we read a book. We found that there's a correlation between how you typically read a piece of content and how the content visually is presented. So when a car is driving from left to right, it has a much more significant impact when you're looking at it in the kind of Western Hemisphere versus when you're looking at it in the Eastern Hemisphere. So,
and in the Eastern Hemisphere, to actually better to be going right to left, like it's more effective content. I mean, that's a very specific element.
Yeah, so basically more the way how you read it. Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things that's, you think it's quite a simple decision for a creative company to make when they're looking at advert. And it genuinely comes down to just someone going, oh, this looks all right. And we found there's a big old disconnect between when they're doing that sort of work and not actually bringing the consumer back towards it. So a lot of time, creative decisions are very focused on like the actual, I don't know, within the creative meeting. So it sits in a boardroom, a bunch of creatives sit around and go, we want the car to face to left or right. We want the car to be this color, for example. And what we try to do is bring the consumer back into that discussion by doing these really fast pieces of research, delivering insights quickly, which means they can make these alterations and it focuses back again. It's not just a case of a bunch of people in a room kind of arguing it over when you've only got 6 people looking at it, when you can put it in front of 200 consumers. Obviously, putting it in front of 200 consumers is a much more effective way.
Sure. And hopefully a properly sampled set of consumers too, that you have that diverse set and so forth. But I am fascinated by this because it is pressing up against the creative process. So often in this exploration of neuroscience, we've talked about kind of the creatives do their thing and then we test kind of the output. This feels like we can start earlier.
Yeah.
Like obviously, virtually every brand is going to come to the table with certain elements that they want to maintain. That we have presented our product this way so far. Although I could almost see, I want to reboot this product. Can we go completely open now? Like what are the touchstone elements we want from this? And maybe use neuroscience right from the beginning to test all of that.
Yeah, exactly. We've done it for a whole bunch of different companies, and sometimes, like you said, they come to us and they might have a very specific brand identity already. We can test that brand identity and see if it's actually lying emotionally against what they think they are.
Interesting.
I think something which we talk a lot to brands about is they have a big care about what their internal perspective is of themselves. So most people know their company, whether you call them company motto, company commandments, however you kind of word them, they know them off by heart internally.
Right.
And they're trying to sort of sell products in that same ilk. So they're trying to relate those two things together. So what we're now able to do is go to them, okay, so you think you're selling yourself this way. What's actually working or isn't working is this, this, and this. And how can we adapt that on a visual standpoint?
Interesting. Because you're almost interviewing your customer and you're using neuroscience to validate the statements they bring to the beginning of the conversation.
Exactly. And that gives them so much more power going forward. So it means that they can arc their whole kind of campaigns around the visual standpoint and have, we like to call it sort of visual ingredients. So we can take all their different visual elements and find out what are the things that are working most in line with what they want to be working with. And then we say, really kind of push these forward. So they've got a specific brand color that works, if they've got a specific, character within their piece of content that's working better than others on an emotional level, it's something which can help them push and help them kind of build that up.
Right. But also make sure you succeed. If you're validating their item, they're coming saying, hey, this has been our brand color. It's like, we should test this and see how it's doing. Yeah, exactly. And then do we emphasize it? Do we de-emphasize it? Like, how do you improve on those core elements? Even before you start constructing, so what's the shape of this campaign? What are the customers we're going after? And then, being able to test all of that to, I guess, lay out some ingredients for the creatives, right? Most creatives I've ever worked with kind of want a bit of a box. Like don't tell them what to do, but put some edges around the box. Like they're more excited to work within that than do whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the game I said to you earlier. I think we're not trying to take creativity away from them. We always want creatives, whether it's an actual artist or the creative team, creative directors. We want them to be coming up with the ideas and they understand it from an art direction perspective. And all we're doing is bringing the consumer back into that conversation. Right. Because brands will have segmentation pieces on their various audiences and who they're targeting, which will be done pre-campaign. And all we're trying to do is keep that segmentation piece kind of running through the whole production of the piece of content. So when you think a production for an advert can take anywhere up to, it could take over a year, even if it's a massive piece.
Sure.
So if you've had that conversation a year ago from now, you've got to make sure that you're consistently keeping those emotional themes going through.
Well, I got to think it's exciting to routinely validate that data over that story arc.
Exactly.
And at all these different levels. Like certainly I like the pre-work piece, but then as you start getting different storyboards put together, it sounds like you could test each of those storyboards as well.
Yeah, you can test at any point, and we want people to be optimizing throughout. Really, we want them to have that kind of thought process where you've already, like you said, you've done the concepting stuff, you've got to the storyboarding, you have a quite specific idea about it, and the changes as it gets further down get smaller and smaller. But what we can do is we can still test those changes at any point, really. So even when the changes are something as tiny as, I don't know, a slight reflection off a piece of, I don't know, a bottle, for example, we can test that, and we do get measurable results against that because it's all linking back to emotions. So what it just means is you're constantly optimizing at every point, because it's very hard for brands to really tell the true success of any piece of advertising. I think it was Henry Ford said this stuff about he knows that half his advertising works, but doesn't know which half it is.
Right.
It's always something that people don't really know.
Well, I mean, we always ultimately measure our advertising by its sales results.
Exactly.
The question is, how much money did we leave on the table, and what mistakes did we make along the way? So, I mean, I like this suggestion that we're course correcting along, although you're really not measuring creativity here. You're more measuring the response to it, the emotional response to it.
Yeah. So it's creativity is how we get those different ideas in front of consumers, but it is about measuring that emotional perception. So how are people responding to that on a completely visual level? And as I said before, the visual ingredients is something which we're really interested to learn about, and what are the specific individual ingredients that make people tick in a certain emotional way. And then we can use that. So then it goes back on itself again. So we use that emotional perception data that we receive, and we can use that to refine the creativity. So it's kind of, they're both feeding into each other. It's a constantly iterative process. So the creatives make the content which feeds into the actual consumers, and the consumers' data feeds back into how creatives work. And it's a constantly learning process. We're not, like I said, it's not hard and fast science. It's about mixing the two together and making sure they work in sort of tandem throughout the whole kind of time that we can work with the consumer and we can work with the brand to understand how to put their product forward.
Yeah, I also appreciate the idea that typically in that iterative cycle, your creative team is going back to the customer, in this sense, the brand owners, and often they're making that assessment, and they're not necessarily the consumer. It makes a lot more sense we have built this thing, then we went out and did some testing using implicit or whatever neuroscience flavor you prefer, and this is what your consumer set responds to. So I gotta think it's frustrating for a creative to present an idea to someone who isn't the person who would buy, and have them be able to say yay or nay. Like, that's very frustrating, because you think this is something that should respond well to the consumer, but you never ask the consumer about it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the whole thing about them sitting in sort of an echo chamber. And it's not a fault of a person. It's just kind of by design of the process.
Sure. But you literally can drive an agency in the wrong direction, where I start trying to please the person writing the check rather than please the person that's actually going to buy the product.
Yeah. And I mean, how many times do you hear about brands having absolute disaster shows from pieces of content? And there are always massive global brands who put the work in to understand what their process is, but it just lands really flat, and it can land in a really negative way. And I think if you have this constant checking loop, and we do it through neuroscience and creativity, and I think there's many other ways that brands could do it. It's just having that constant check. I mean, consumer centric, if you go to any conference nowadays, you'll see the words consumer centric being plastered everywhere. And I think that making sure creativity is consumer centric is something which can stop those things where you go, actually, this is really sliding down. This is having a massive negative emotional impact. And we can take a step back and understand where that's coming from. Because both us and the brand can work together, and they know their audience better than we'll know their audience, and we can say, what do we think within this piece of content they're reacting poorly against?
Yeah.
Is it something compositionally that they're reacting poorly against, or is it actually the overall idea they're reacting poorly against? It just is about bringing that always back together and back to being, what does the customer want? Because at the end of the day, they're looking to sell to them.
Sure. Well, I also feel like if you've waited till you've pretty much made that ad before you're testing it and then find out it's got a negative response, I mean, I'm glad you didn't run it publicly, so you avoided that disaster. But you're probably going to have a tough time salvaging what you've made, where if I caught it in the storyboarding phase, maybe we could have revised it and undone whatever that negative impetus was.
Exactly. And it's all that stuff to do with we call it de-risking creative. And I mean, the risk is the financial risk. And if you've got right to the end and you've not reached those checkpoints, then you've spent X thousands, X millions, X whatever pounds, dollars on that. And that means that you've already made that risk and you've already lost out on that risk. And like you said, it's very difficult to salvage.
Right.
But if you're constantly bringing it back to emotional perception, which we know from all our own studies and all the academic knowledge out there, that people buy on emotions. Sure. And I think most brands would know that themselves. So if we're linking every piece of creativity to what the emotional perception of it is, it just puts you in a completely different headspace compared to other brands who aren't doing that. And you can tell quite quickly when things are and aren't working. And it's now got to the point where neuroscience is so accessible, and you can run the tests we do, all that hosted online. So it means that there's no sort of waiting for people to go off to a laboratory and spend a few days of strapping people up to the electrodes and coming back and not getting any kind of answers within a couple of weeks. We can get answers back by the end of the day, sort of thing. So if you're doing some very quick concept work, we can run it overnight and have some results back to you in the morning. And that means that you're not actually losing out on the whole kind of product production cycle. Which, as I said, keeping that
creative flow going too, right? It's like
exactly.
But the idea that you're getting course corrections along the way, are you finding, depending on the demographic work you're working with, and I'm thinking millennials versus an older generation, that you have a different set of emotional impacts you're going after?
Yeah, massively. So everyone knows that millennials have kind of grown up with seeing content all the time. They're kind of the always on generation. And I don't think it's a secret that millennials are sort of a bit more switched off when it comes to looking at advertising content, or
desensitized
in terms of they see so much of it. It's very easy for things to get lost in the myriad of pieces of content they see. And it's something which we found from our results. So one of the things we test a lot of our pieces of content against is distinctiveness. So how unique a piece of content is. And we know there's a correlation between how unique a piece of content is and how much of an emotional pull it has. An emotional pull is a metric we can use to kind of be analogous with kind of intent to purchase and things like that. So we found that millennials in particular see images as much less distinctive and have much less interest in the content, which leads to them having less of a desire to kind of basically want to learn more about that piece of content. Because people create adverts for people to generate intrigue, and they want to go, okay, what's that about? Let's go find out more about it. Let's end up purchasing it. That's what all the brand's end goal really is. So if you can try to figure out what are the key pieces of kind of visual content that stimulate those audiences, so especially younger audiences, if you can create some distinctive assets which work for them, that's you kind of already, again, taking a jump above someone else, because they're not necessarily doing that. They'll see at the end, millennial sales are up X percentage this week, so that's great. But if you can kind of optimize emotionally and visually, because we see 90% of our stuff, our content we take in visually, we have a tiny part of it comes in from our other senses. Like, we are visual beings. So if you can optimize to that visual sense and make your assets be more distinctive to that audience, I think it's something which we found has been really successful for brands we've worked with. But it's like you said, demographics is something which we look at quite a lot, and we look at seeing what specific audiences want. And again, it links back to what we were saying earlier. It's about being specific to your market and being specific to what your audience's needs are. And no two audiences are going to be identical. But I think if you can design things that are specifically visually stimulating for your audience, and I think it's putting brands in a really good position.
And I also could appreciate that if you're going to play that distinctiveness game, there's a certain edginess to it. And this is where you're also taking some risks. So being able to test routinely, say, how close to the edge are we? Have we gone, the edge being, if we're at the top of it, that's going to be very distinctive and potentially very effective, as opposed to we've gone over the edge and now we're doing harm to our brand, not benefiting it.
Yeah, for sure. And that harm to brand can come from loads of things as well. I think, that's the most important thing. If you catch that super soon, then it's even less of a risk, isn't it? And that removing that negative connotation that your brand has from something which can now be fixed quite quickly is going to become even harder, because once consumers become aware that it's something that can be fixed quite easily in terms of just them taking a bit more understanding. They're going to be more pushed away from that brand. It's going to be so much harder for them to sort of dig themselves out of that hole.
Yeah, you've made your job harder. And so the more earlier we can test and repeatedly test as we press against that creative process, the less chance we have of having that kind of disaster. I don't know if you have any particular examples of this kind of behavior, because I've had a fun conversation with you so far, but it's pretty academic. Yeah, I like this idea of we should be testing all the way along the creative process, but what's the outputs look like?
So there's a whole bunch of different things, and like I said, we look at it from the whole visual standpoint of any brand. So it's not just their creative content. We can test any visual asset. I think a really cool example we've got is one where we worked with a bespoke watch brand who came to us and just said, hey, look, we have a product, which was the watch, and we have nothing else to go with it. We didn't have a brand name, didn't have a logo, didn't have anything.
Is that exciting to get like a kind of greenfield opportunity? It's like, we have a product. Massively. Let's figure out how to sell it.
Massively. It's one of those things where it's just like, we have a blank canvas, and you give that to creatives, and like you said earlier, the blank canvas is a good thing, but they also want some sort of direction. Yeah. So I guess that's where we can use this research to sort of hone it in. So what we did was we tested a whole bunch of different logo designs, a whole bunch of different brand names, which were included in those logo designs. And that helped us actually land on a brand name for the brand, a logo design. And then we moved on to the creative stuff using what we learned in the first instance. So we knew kind of what the consumers we were looking to target were looking for. And we then ended up testing a whole bunch of different design motifs and ideas directly against that brand's particular sort of, I guess, emotional levers, emotional assets they wanted to understand. So that every brand had its own particular number of things, but this brand in particular wanted to show off its like elegance and its luxuriousness, and the fact it was a bespoke watch brand specifically for a female audience, and they wanted to attract those people in particular.
Interesting. Because typically watches are sold to men, right? It's very much a masculine product.
Yeah, and I think one of the things in that sector as well, there's a very set way of doing things that a lot of brands do. So if you look at a lot of watch imagery across brands, it will tend to involve a high-level celebrity, especially when it's more male watches, and you get a lot of sort of the high-level celebrities, things like James Bond or Hugh Jackman, people like that,
right,
be part of the campaign. So it's kind of selling the old masculinity vibes, I guess, is what their kind of angle is. And it's just been something which we've done for years. And it's the same for the female watch brands. And what we didn't want to do is go down that route, because we thought there's more interesting visual ways to sell that idea. And that links back to the distinctive side of things. So it's how can you stand out from what your competitors are doing? So what we did with them is we've made a whole bunch of different background designs, some of them more kind of loosely patterned, some different colors, all of it still focusing on the same product. Then just tested them against these visual levers, which we knew the audience that they wanted to work with enjoyed. And then we were able to build up a sort of palette of these were the things that were working. So we knew the certain background design work, we knew a certain color work, we knew a sort of orientation of product work. And it was ticking off all the right boxes and was making the visual standpoint stand out quite nicely. So from that, we were able to go to them, look, we've basically designed this directly in line with your consumers' expectations at all points. And that gave them as a brand new brand going into a massive market. So the watch market is, everyone knows all the big players out there, and very few people will know any of the small people in there. Right. So it's quite easy for them to get swallowed up. And they were quite nervous. I mean, they had experience in the watch industry, but they hadn't had experience making their own brand before. So that's probably quite a daunting task when you're moving into a market when you've got multi-billion-dollar companies in there. And knowing that we designed to their audience specifically on an emotional level really helped them have that confidence to go, okay, let's go forward and actually launch this brand.
Right. And our product is distinctive, and we've tested that all the way along. The $1 billion is a sales thing. It's not a requirement for making the product. You have to spend some money. We don't have to spend that much money.
Yeah, exactly.
But to be distinctive amongst the giants, I mean, that's a classic story too, right? That what you go after what they missed.
Yeah. Yeah. And they could have just done what other brands have done, but it's quite easy to get kind of lost in that. They could have gone down the traditional route of tried and practiced kind of methodologies, and they would never really found out that these sort of ideas would have worked if they hadn't tested them using neuroscience. They would, you might have got something similar from a focus group, but we know there's a whole bunch of issues with focus groups in terms of things like a whole number of biases which come along with you sitting in a room of people and agreeing with them for the sake of agreeing with them. And I think,
especially if you're looking for a new idea,
exactly,
like it's very easy when you think about the watch market and all those big companies to say, well, they became big on these looks, we should follow that look. Except now you're an also ran. To do something original is to break out of that, and you kind of have to test that in a unique way to take that chance.
Yeah, and it's easy now. So it's one of those things that it wasn't easy, now it is easy, and it means that we can be reassuring people that what they're doing and what we're getting our artists to do is not we're not chasing up a tree that's not going to work for them in the long term. They have those we give that brand the visual assets and the visual identity they've got, and that's something they can stick onto. And obviously, when we're looking to update the campaigns further down the line, we can look at change that slightly. But now they've got a very distinctive and unique kind of look for themselves, and it means that they do, like you said, with bigger brands, they've made their look over years and years, and that's what people know them for. So you've got to become known for kind of your own thing and using that emotional storytelling. And I think it shows when you look at the way they talk about their brand. They can, when they're talking about their own brand on their website, they can kind of tell we've literally used emotions from the ground up. And the reason we're at the position, the reason we look like this is because we use emotions to drive our visual decisions, which is a unique approach to doing brand building from the ground up. It's obviously one that's successful, but it's a very interesting.
How do the creative folks respond to that kind of feedback? Coming from what would arguably be the most technical kind of approach to understanding an emotion, using neuroscience and that kind of statistical feedback you get from that. I think to take that to the art team and say that background had measured this way and this background measured that way. Does it work for them? Are they delighted? Like, is it validating or is it frustrating?
I think it's one of those things that, like any new technology, it takes a while for people who've been doing it a certain way to pick it up and kind of adopt a new methodology of doing things. And it's something which, as we've become more confident, we've been doing this now for 8 years, I think, in this space. So we're aware of how it works, and we know what works and what doesn't work, especially when you're approaching the artist. And I think as long as you're saying, well, look, like I said to you earlier, it's not a prescriptive science. So we're not going to go to an artist and say your work's bad, your work's good. It's not that sort of way of doing things. It's more saying these are the parts of the project which are working. These are the parts which aren't working. How can we blend those two together? And that's where we really need the artist's support. Like I'm not the person as a head of insights to sit there and go, this is exactly how we blend these particular pieces of visual ingredients that work together. It's the artists have to work with us on the next step, which is take those parts and make it into a whole kind of visual identity and a whole sort of cohesive composition, which works quite nicely. So once you sell it to them like that, rather than saying good versus bad, it means it's a much more kind of symbiotic relationship. Like we both need each other equally to create the best content in the long run. Yeah,
I think it would be exciting to have a source of feedback that you're being creative within that space. Plus, if we get a good response from a background, we get a good response for an angle, then we make a new set of tests that combine the optimal of those two and get even better results. So that there's some kind of sense of consistency to that. It's not, I'm throwing it to a thing that gives me random numbers back and I don't know why, how we get better. Like that, I think you'd win a lot of minds that day that these three elements tested separately when combined created even stronger results. That, who can resist that? It's like, I have now getting consistent, understandable feedback that helps me make a better product.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things where artists love it the most is a feedback round is something which is like inherent in creative anyway. So it goes back and forth between the client, the agency, whoever. And if you can sit in that meeting and go, the reason we've made these decisions is X, Y, Z, it stops that needless conversation where you're going around about certain details that no one really understands. It comes down to opinion versus opinion.
Right.
And it can be quite difficult to actually come out with a succinct kind of answer to that question, because if everyone disagrees, and there's a whole bunch of different things.
I mean, to be able to say we tested this against 200 consumers in this demographic area, and these are the results we've got.
Yeah,
you come with a way bigger stick.
Yeah, massively.
Right. This is not an individual's opinion anymore. This is properly tested.
Yeah, for sure. And we present the data, present it as however we like, really, but everyone loves a bar chart, so you can go look, we can literally show you the massive difference.
Yes.
So this is on the negative end, this is on the positive end, and it's about, so we want to negate as much of this negative emotion, whichever that emotion will be, as much as possible, and push it up to this level, so we can break that down for them and go, this is why we chose it, we've actually tested it, we can keep doing this process, and it stops those conversations which could take time out of people who don't necessarily have the amples of time to be going around in circles about certain things. It just removes that slight ambiguity. Or even if a brand's not doing this sort of testing, when they have those sort of discussions, you go, actually, let's bring this in now, and we can basically just be there, sort of, like you said, data source for them.
Yeah, I could see when you get to that impasse of nobody's really sure what to do next. It's like, how about we insert some science into this and get some measurable results?
Yeah, exactly. And I think brands use data from everywhere, don't they? So we're not necessarily adding a new thing to them, really. We're adding data to them. It's where the data comes from slightly different, and how it's presented slightly different. But the actual understanding of how data can be impactful in businesses is super important, as we know for the past few years, all people already talk about. And this is just an extra slice of data that I think gives them a really powerful tool to look at emotional understanding. I mean, how often can you say you can understand? I mean, humans find it really hard to understand emotions on a personal level. Well, but if we're able to kind of break that down for them on this level, kind of in a commercial space, it's just a massive advantage for them to sell better visual stories.
Yeah, I think it's very compelling. And you've hinted at this a couple of times in the conversation, Ollie, that avoiding that negative emotion is almost the most important thing. For better or worse, we were wired, that survival reflex we have is wired into those negative emotions are far more powerful than the positive ones.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think something I might have said before was, if you consider everyone looks at bad reviews when they go to a restaurant, go to a hotel, and people remember the bad things. And if you just apply that to your visual language, your visual creativity, it's the exact same story. If people have some negative emotion, it doesn't have to be a massive, people don't have to see it and be absolutely disgusted. It could just be there's a low level negative perception within them when they look at your brand.
Right.
And when they see a piece of content from your brand. And no one's going to buy something that when they innately feel negatively towards the brand for whatever reason, they're not going to be encouraged to, when they see it in a shop, to pick it up. They're not going to be encouraged for a whole host of reasons. So if we can negate that negative side of things, so it's not necessarily about building up on the positive sort of thing. So if you've got, if you're looking to become a really premium brand, and a lot of your content isn't necessarily premium, which could be for a whole host of reasons. If you've got some options, some visual options, which are seen as really negative, so I don't know, example would be something like a brown background really kind of pushes down the level of premium.
Right.
And we know that brands typically go for darker backgrounds as a way of seeing premium. But what we've actually found is consumers don't necessarily associate those two together. And that's something we're actually exploring at the moment to understand, is there a connection with them, every brand doing it versus them kind of, the people just, the internal consumers, expect that the internal brands expect that kind of black and dark and moody is associated with premium, but consumers see it so often. Yeah. They don't necessarily actually
it no longer is an effective strategy. And that's a tough one to challenge those sort of believed to be known approaches, to actually test those and go, this is no longer effective. And we're going to go outside of that box. That's pretty interesting. But I mean, how many times have you had a customer who said to you, I want it new and bright and fresh, with no definition around any of that? But
all
to
the
go
time,
after
all
those
the time. We get those things.
Yeah.
We get those things. They go, I want it to look sexy. And I was like, what does that mean? we're talking about a cosmetics brand. Like, how can we actually do that? But we're at the point now where we can do that. We do have an ability to understand. We have a toolkit where we know certain things work and certain things don't work. And that is the massive power of using neuroscience in creativity. Because previously, those kind of vague concepts of different emotions, which every brand will have their own individual ones, were just something which we go, we guess this kind of works, and it would have been taken on past experience and maybe some level of consumer insights, which was done prior to the actual production going ahead. But now we can just keep those checkpoints constantly, and we know
Well, and measured against the customer base as it stands today. I think that's a very important part, is people's own perception of those things shift over time. So you can keep things up by doing routine testing around that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't want to be one of the podcasts that bangs on about COVID, but we obviously saw that perception changed over COVID. And we actually ran an internal campaign around our Christmas campaign. So our Christmas campaign last year was about a tortoise called Tortellini who was taking a journey through the year. So each month represented a different stage of the pandemic. And we were able to run this testing and understand emotionally how that sort of idea of how the year progressed, how perception changed significantly at different times. So not just testing the visual side of things, but testing how people feel a level of disconnect and reconnection, and things like, it was specific to the UK. So a lot of the story was about the UK market and our various levels of lockdown. But we were able to kind of find a really interesting story and connect that to people's perception changing, sometimes really rapidly. So sometimes from literally March to April, there's a big shift, and then people would slowly feel a certain way. And then when a certain announcement would happen, there'd be a snap change again. So just able to tell that story emotionally really easily and understand that, your audience isn't a fixed pair.
Well, and target carefully too. It's easy to get in a negative loop on that as well. But if you get it right, you're talking about resonating with an entire demographic base in a particular location. So it's pretty powerful.
It's awesome. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. And it is interesting to think in terms of how much change the pandemic is going to do to the consumer market in the long term, and that a lot of our assumptions are going to struggle going forward. Yeah. And it's good to go out and test all of those assumptions again. Callum, this is a really great conversation. I appreciate your insight around this measuring of emotion along the way as we develop creative assets and build our brand stories in this obviously changed market. Like we're at a different time now.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's an awesome thing to be a part of, and I really enjoy finding out how we can kind of adapt things at such an intricate level, which is something which people wouldn't thought was possible maybe even 10 years ago.
Definitely a different world. Callum Gould, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Richard.
And thanks for listening to Understanding Consumer Neuroscience.